Speaking of fish and fish bowls.
Right.
All right, we are live on YouTube. Send this out. Okay, and Chris, I am just getting ready to bring up the videos.
Roger that.
It's very professional of you. Okay, I am going to. Okay, Chris, you can go ahead and click broadcast. Hello and welcome. We are pleased to bring you this conversation as the official kickoff of a new series of online events powered by Ascend. If you have any connection or technical issues today, please use the chat function to chat Chris P, and he will help you resolve your issues. If you have questions for our panel, please feel free to use the Q&A located at the bottom of your screen. And now I'm pleased to introduce Sandy Magnus and our panel.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sandy Magnus. I'm currently the Deputy Director of Engineering and the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering at the DoD. But more importantly, I'm also a former astronaut and a member of the Guiding Coalition for Ascend, which is an event in November that will address space topics on a deeper level. We are pleased to bring you this conversation as the official kickoff of our Ascend event series. It's an event created by AIAA, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, and it's dedicated to accelerating the building of our off-world future. And you can learn more at ascend.events. What I'd like to do now is have each panelist introduce themselves, and then we'll pick it up and jump right into our exciting conversation today. So Manu, why don't you kick it off?
So hello, everybody. My name is Manu Ratnas Babathi, and I am a research engineer at the Space Enabled Research Group at MIT's Media Lab. At Space Enabled, I look at sustainability in a really broad sense. So firstly, how can we ensure that we're utilizing space technologies for the benefit of Earth, but also looking at the sustainability of the space environment and exploration in general.
Catherine?
Hi, so I'm Catherine Denning. I'm an associate professor in anthropology at York University in Canada, in Toronto. And I am an anthropologist and an archaeologist, and I work on the biggest picture of humanity's history and now also on humanity's future. And my original interest in space was in the potential for life elsewhere, so in more distant locations, but my interest in ethics and our relationships with each other and other life and space have kind of moved inwards as humans are moving outwards. So that's my contribution to this conversation today.
Okay, and Kathy?
Hi, my name is Kathy Larini, and I'm an engineer. I work for Dynetics. I'm part of the Human Landing System team, and we're very excited about putting the first woman on the moon in 2024. But before that, I served as an aerospace consultant, and before that, I worked for NASA for a number of years. And while I was at NASA, I was very involved in developing space exploration architectures. I also worked to bring international partners into NASA's Artemis program. So I was, through a number of different activities, worked with space agencies all around the world to bring them on board and create a joint future consensus of where we go, how we go, who does what. I'm pleased to be here today.
Thank you, guys. And we'll jump right in. You know, as someone who's been off the planet, I can tell you that your experience of the planet, your perception of the planet changes. And you look back at the Earth, and what you see basically is one world, one spaceship, if you will, where we're all crew as part of that spaceship. We're at the period of time in space, human spaceflight, where more and more people are going to be able to experience that. You know, tomorrow is another attempt with the SpaceX launch to launch humans from the capsule of a private company into space, and that will be available for other people to purchase services on, as well as the one from Boeing coming later. And so it's just the very beginning of this concept of, wow, people can move off of the planet in a greater manner than we have had in the past. And so we're here today to talk about what does that mean, and what happens when we get a critical mass of people off the planet? What does that mean? What does it mean to have an off-world civilization? How would we live? Things like this. And it's a really massive conversation. And in order to break it down, we're going to talk about 3 different aspects of it. But let me put some boundaries around the conversation first. We're going to kind of stay a little bit grounded. We're not going to get completely out into science fiction land. So we're not talking about a planet B. We're really leveraging off what we know today. So for example, we've had an International Space Station for 2 decades where people have been living constantly. We've had people live in space for as long as a year, and in a few instances, even longer. We are exploring moving beyond low Earth orbit for the first time in half a century, and hope that leads us further out as the decades continue. So that's kind of the boundaries around what we're talking about today. And we're going to break it into 3 sections. We're going to chunk it into how do we get there, which is meaning what is it going to take to establish a true off-world presence, and at what cost? That's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is how do we live there? What does that mean? And that just doesn't mean the habitats, but how we live as a society. What does societal interaction look like? What does a civilization off-world evolve to? And then finally, how do we stay there? How will we evolve? What's sustainment look like? What's the future of a society that's maybe has never lived on Earth and they have no reference point from that viewpoint? And so those are the 3 questions that we're going to consider as we go in. And so Manu, I'll start with you. So how close are we to having a viable off-world presence, and one that goes just beyond research?
Right. So thank you, Sandy. From a technical standpoint, we're already developing design solutions that are helping us go further as well as stay longer. And there's a couple of international examples on this already. So, you know, Kathy mentioned the Lunar Gateway, which is supporting the Artemis mission, which is a great example of collaboration between the commercial entities as well as international partnerships. From China, we see Taiwan-1, which will be launched in July, as well as the launch of different modules of the Chinese space station, as well as a call for new cohort of Chinese astronauts. From the UAE, we see them having plans of the Emirates Mars mission HOPE, as well as building habitable Mars settlement by the 22nd century, as well as, of course, ESA's Moon Village concepts. So there's already steady progress that's being made to understand the challenges as well as the complexities. But what we really have to do in order to build a viable and sustainable, and that word I think is very important, the sustainable off-world presence really dictates a more holistic approach to the traditional engineering approaches that we've taken into the past. And by this, I mean that we really need to put human first in spacecraft design in order to account for mission constraints on crew itself. And one example of this is data transmission limitations or even communication latency between Earth and Mars, and really highlights the need to put into account effective human-computer interfaces. So while we do want to talk about what's beyond research and development, and really what is the implementation of now, research still holds a very pivotal role in the iterations and refinements as we learn more about the environments that we want to go into.
Okay, thank you, Manu. Catherine?
It's always better if I unmute myself. Thanks. I really agree with Manu about the importance of research going forward. I mean, obviously that's critical. As an anthropologist, one of my jobs is to kind of poke at the question. So what I would do in approaching that question of how close are we to having a viable off-world presence is I would ask, well, who's we in this conversation? So obviously we're at a really interesting moment, in US history in terms of the balance between public and private in terms of space. But we also are at a really interesting moment internationally where some spacefaring nations are gaining ground extremely rapidly and others are not. And then in terms of that divide between the public and the private, I don't know, obviously, I guess my question is when this initiative to kind of rebalance the commercial and the national in the US was started, was there a recognition that there would be a time when billionaires have the kind of clout and the power that they do today? And also in terms of, say, where that money for space ultimately comes from, I think an important question in light of our current circumstances, the pandemic, is, well, taxes. So one of the reasons that you have so many hyper wealthy individuals in the US is because billionaires are taxed a lot less than they are in many other countries. So that gives you the wealth, that gives you the base from which to have a significant private move into space. But if you have that at the same time as a significant portion of the population actually doesn't have access to healthcare on Earth, then I think we really have to ask those questions about who is we when we're talking about these moves out into space. So then that calls into question, who is space for, who are we serving? And also in terms of space resources, recent decisions made that some nations regard the harvesting of space resources as being a legal and good thing to do. Not everybody is totally enthusiastically on board with that. And there's just kind of one more thing I'd like to add at this stage of the game, which is, regarding that sustainability piece and that also that kind of global equity piece. There are issues regarding space that need to be hammered out multilaterally that haven't been, like orbital debris mitigation. Like, we don't actually have a super plan in place for all of that just yet. These things are concerns going forward. So those are just a couple points.
Excellent points, Kathy. And we'll come back and have a discussion. We want to hear from all the panelists first. So Kathy, if you.
Yeah, so you asked how close are we to having a viable off-world presence and what would it take to get there? I will say it will take governments leading the way, right? It's going to be a very expensive endeavor. And if billionaires could do it on their own, I think Elon Musk would already be on Mars or nearly there, right? It's a very expensive endeavor, and it's going to take governments to lead the way, and governments doing it together with other stakeholders, other partners. Like, I love the private sector interest. I love the billionaire funding interest. I love the academia and how engaged academia is in trying to find solutions to the problems, to the challenges, to the research gaps, let's say. So, but I do think it's going to take governments to lead the way. And I think if you look at the moon and the ISRU community, there's a very vibrant in situ resource utilization community, especially around lunar volatiles, right? We know from spacecraft that have orbited the moon that there are volatiles on the moon, but we don't have any ground truth information to know really what's there. What's the nature and composition of what's there? What is it is it really a resource? How hard will it be to extract it? How hard will it be to process it and get it in the pure forms we need for propellant or for breathing gas, breathing air constituents? Those questions are not going to be, even though they result in a nice opportunity for private sector investment, there's so many unknowns that private sector right now is having a hard time saying, look, I'm going to go all in, or I'm going to go big in this. Everybody's watching on the sidelines, waiting for NASA and its government partners to do those initial prospecting missions, to get the information that will provide the clarity. So, typically, governments, lead the way. They find out what's there. They help buy down the risks. They create an environment where the private sector can make informed decisions about how to invest and how they will get a return on their investment. And I think what NASA's doing with the Artemis program is a fantastic start towards our first step off Earth, with the moon as the first step.
Yeah, it's interesting. If I can just maybe frame this in the context, addressing everything that you guys are commenting on in the context of an exploration paradigm where, clearly looking at this through a US lens, because that's our history, the expansion across the West and what really happened there. It was messy. To Catherine, to your point, it was really messy. There were people going forward and maybe not knowing where they were going, driven by different reasons. There was not a lot of law in place when people started propagating forward. So that's one methodology. And you look at what's going on in Antarctica with the exploration that's going on down there, it's been pretty well structured. There's a comment from out in the audience that, can we use the deep ocean as a way to frame some of our approaches to space, and how do we get there, and what kind of paradigms we might use? That's another one. The technical problems are a little bit different, but everyone wants to comment on that. Catherine?
I've come to, after a lot of time spent thinking about space and when and how historical and Earth-based analogies are appropriate and useful. And this is kind of strange coming from somebody who does a lot of work in history. I've come to the conclusion that a lot of the time they do more harm than good. And here's why. It's because many of us think that we understand our history, but we don't really know it all that well. And present company accepted. It's that, we readily use the frontier analogy, for example, in relation to space. But what most of us know really about, say, frontier history, if you're a really avid avocational history buff, maybe you've read 4 books, something like that. And people usually would have read them, maybe 20 years ago, and they may not have updated their knowledge continually. And typically those books will also have been written from a very particular perspective. So one thing that we're doing in Canada, for example, we're working very hard to decolonize our history. And that means, taking First Nations perspectives extremely seriously. So that's, of course, the big part of the history of North America is like, there were plenty of people here already. So that's a huge disanalogy, of course, to the exploration of space. And it does matter. Similarly, there are enormous differences between the ocean, although, it's an interesting legal regime in regard to, the use of resources, et cetera. And Sandy spent more time under the ocean than I think most humans, so she can speak to that. But so there's important disanalogies as well. And so we often try to think about space through something that we know better. It's a very common kind of maneuver. But I sometimes wonder if we should just focus strictly on space and stop trying to humanize it in terms of the things that we know, and stop trying to make it more earthly in terms of the things that we know.
Well, to the point where people's experiences shape their thinking patterns, that's really hard to do. And I know Kathy, and Manu will come to you in a second, but Kathy, I know the conversations you've had with the different space agencies around the world about what we might do beyond low Earth orbit are all shaped by their experiences as well, which are different experiences of exploration, even though they are within a box, but it's a bigger box. So there's a much more diverse set of ideas about what exploration is there. And maybe Kathy, you can share some of those conversations.
Yeah, that's really true. I think, while a deep sea endeavor would be an analogous thing, as Catherine said, you're not going to be advancing as much the specific things you need for space. Space is much bigger. It's complex in different dimensions. I think international partners that I talk to have a variety of reasons to want to explore, right? And I found that one of the most striking things was the moon and the role the moon plays in many societies, right? The moon is a protector. The moon is always there. The moon plays a role in mythology and religion and all sorts of cultural makeup, a makeup of many different cultures. So there's a lot of interest in wanting to be part of it. I also found that there was, the U.S. We like to say we went to the moon in the Apollo program, and in fact we did. But while the world shared in that, there is a sense of many nations that they want to be part of such an effort. It doesn't matter that the U.S. has been there. They want to be part of it. They want to bring that sense of contribution to a global effort to their people. They think that will bring a nice connection for the students they're trying to energize. It will bring a common set of challenges between young people all over the world as we look to solve these problems. And of course, when you talk about what people want to contribute, you asked about that, but everybody's looking for the niche for the way that they can contribute something that's just as important as the big rockets and the big spacecraft that larger space agencies bring. And I think that's important for space agencies like NASA, who are leading the way, to recognize that and create critical roles for everybody.
Now, Manu, some last thoughts on this before we move to the next topic?
Yeah, just to build on what Kathy was saying about having a role for everybody. And so she's absolutely correct that all countries want to play a role in off-world presence, but we have to come to the realization that not everybody at the moment has exploration or human spaceflight in their current agenda. There are many emerging space nations who are really just finding their feet in the space agency. And so one thing that we need to take account for is not to have this technical divide between the more established space nations who are doing these grand, really ambitious goals versus other countries, again, who are just finding their feet in this.
So we could clearly spend hours just talking about this topic, and there's a rich set of conversations I think we could perhaps do as a follow-on, but we do want to cover our other two questions today. So we're going to move on to the next one, which is, how do we live there? The practicalities of living in space, it's different. When you get up there, we talked earlier, I guess, about how experiences shape your views and your perceptions. And you do, once you're in space and you have a chance to look at the Earth and experience microgravity and understand there's a completely different way to live. I'm kind of curious about what impact it's going to have on civilization here on Earth even, let alone what kind of a civilization is created in space. But as more and more people get their perception shifted about our planet and have the ability to move off of our planet, how is that going to shape who we are as people, and what people will have the opportunity to do, and where is the tipping point? And to a certain point, as humans, we build bureaucracies, right? That's what we do. At what point do we have enough people off the planet that we build our first bureaucracy in space, just as a little lighthearted note? So Kathy, why don't we start with you this time?
Oh, sorry, I muted. Yeah, thanks. Your question adds more questions to me. I mean, how are we there just as explorers for a handful of people for a couple of months at a time, or are we there with a certain number of people that have gone and stayed, or are we there able to make trips back and forth? It takes 3 days to go to the moon. It takes 6 months to go to Mars. Are people able to make routine trips there and back? And how much of a connection do they keep to people here on Earth? And I think that I'm sure we'll evolve, right, from short trips to longer stays to hopefully we'll be able to just beam back and forth. Who knows? But I think the answer to your question lies in how you see that evolving, frankly. I think as an engineer, How will we live there? I focus immediately on, okay, how can I build an infrastructure that allows the people that are there to be productive, right? Because it's not going to be a sustainable effort if people don't have something to do and they can't produce value either to them there or to people back on Earth. So what does that infrastructure look like, and what does it take to support it? I think ending up quickly learning how to use local resources, quickly learning how to generate power from the sun or local resources, doing basic infrastructure things that will help sustain a longer presence are going to be an early focus, and those will give purpose to certain people. But yeah, that's those are
Okay.
my thoughts.
All right, Manu?
So again, Kathy's absolutely right. So as engineers and architects, we think about the where and the what. So where will we live? What does the infrastructure look like? But for many of us who are tuning in virtually, for the first time, we're not experiencing day-to-day social interactions. And it's really highlighted the instinctive human need to connect. So when I think about designing new approaches and engineering systems for off-world civilizations, we really need to think not just about the logistics, but also the communication needed to incorporate a multifaceted human-centric design thinking. And so, building from that what and where question, it really needs to be why. And this comes back to what Catherine was saying, why are we going to an off-world presence? Why are we exploring?
And Catherine?
And again, yeah, and I'm just kind of following on from your points, Manu. I think, again, I kind of have to ask, who is we here? So who exactly will be going, and for what purposes, and for how long? And what will the relationships, as you asked, Sandy, what will the relationships be like between people who go and people who stay? I think it's inevitable that even if we do have more and more people out in space, that most humans will only ever be spectators in this. And so I think, again, that kind of asks, that brings up questions about what most people's relationship with any kind of off-world colonies or off-world settlements will be. At the moment, it's a romantic, kind of exotic, exciting, adventurous dream. But as it becomes reality, will these outposts start to serve kind of a different social function? Will it simply be celebration, or could there be some kind of growing resentments? Will there be geopolitical issues on the moon? I think it's kind of hard to avoid it, even though you can't, under the OST, claim territory on the moon. I mean, the reality is, if you're into in situ resource utilization, it's like, well, you just used all the easily available ice, so that could, I think we won't have a very long period of grace before we end up in these kinds of territorial battles on the moon.
I think that's, if I can jump in, Sandy, I mean, I think that's one of the things that NASA is trying to jumpstart with their so-called Artemis Accords. I don't know if you guys have seen that, but it's really a set of principles, right? It's a set of principles, of values that they would like to see, people that partner with them as they go to the moon and then on to Mars can embrace. And I think, this is going to sound kind of corny, but because I'm a mother, I feel like I can get away with it. But, the more you embrace treating people well and doing the right thing vis-a-vis others, which are, the Artemis Accords are the, the space equivalent of basic, of good, of good neighborly community values, let's say, then I think it'll provide a good foundation, and a foundation that will bridge us long enough to hopefully get to the point where we got a bunch of people living there and we've got to solve the harder problems. One of the things I learned working with international partners at NASA was, if you get a bunch of space agencies together and you talk about something, it's going to be hard. If it's something that's far out and abstract and doesn't need to be solved today, it's going to be impossible, right? So solve problems when they come up. Don't work too hard at solving problems that you may never have. So I'm kind of encouraged by the Artemis Accords setting the stage, and then And then in the future, hopefully we will have harder problems and we'll have to work them out.
So you could hypothesize a situation where there's several different, kind of like Antarctica, right? If you've ever visited down in Antarctica, there's several different colonies, a representation of different countries scattered around the continent doing whatever, right? You can hypothesize that's how we would end up, you know, to the we, Catherine, it's whoever has the resources and the motivation, and, you know, perhaps we as small teams of different countries working together, but there's several of them planning themselves somewhere on the moon to do X. But to the accord piece, if you know if someone else is in dire need of help, you're going to be providing that help, because that's kind of the way, you know, it's a natural instinct to do that. And then at some point, to Kathy's point, there becomes a point of conflict and people have to work through it, and it's probably going to be messy. And Manu, I know you've been engaged with the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space for a while, and they talk about these things there, right?
Absolutely. So they often have this on their agenda. And now that the UN COPUS, so the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, is growing in their membership, you have more and more countries having a say and having an input into these topics that are really shaping the future of our industry. And I will say that, you know, the Office of Outer Space Affairs, UN-USA, has these initiatives where they work with countries to really leverage existing platforms to ensure that there's accessibility and equitable use of different mechanisms and technologies for, again, those countries who are just finding their feet.
Yeah, so if I can insert a question from the audience, I think that is applicable to this conversation that we've just been having, is the question is, do you see leading players sharing, if not resources, at least infrastructure for spacefaring but non-Artemis countries, or even, Manu, to your point, countries that are just getting their foot there for off the world presence in terms of trying to help all of humanity move forward? So I think, Catherine, you'll probably have some comments here as well, but I'd like to throw that question out to the group. Kathy, it was addressed to you, so why don't you go first, and then we'll hear from Catherine and then Manu.
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think realistically, the first time we might get into that is when a US-led Artemis-based group faces a Chinese-led group on the surface of the moon. And if you look at the way the space station helped bridge gaps between the US and the Soviet, in Russia, I guess it was Russia by then, actually no, both, but you know, you can see that space has a great role to play in building geopolitical coalitions. So I think I'm hopeful, right? I'm hopeful. There are obvious reasons why it's difficult for us in the US to work with the Chinese, and for many around the world to work with the Chinese right now. And we're hopeful that over time we can establish you know, the kinds of ways to work together where people protect other people's intellectual property and people you know, are respectful of other people's rights to be there, right? So I think if that, when that day happens, then there will be a very strong geopolitical desire to work it out, to make it, you know, to support each other, frankly. Catherine?
I think, and I'm contrary to my prior comment, I'm going to resort to Earth-based experience here. I think
experience-based. Yeah.
There you go. I think one of the useful things we can think about these multi-stakeholder problems are the different kinds of interests that exist in relation to space, in which we're already seeing conflicts. So, for example, the lunar far side is really valuable territory for astronomers, right? And so are some astronomers who would really like to have that region just protected completely for science, because it's shielded from Earth-based interference. And so it means you can see further and potentially, for example, discover extraterrestrial life. And similarly, if we're not talking about the moon, if we're moving just as far as Mars, no further, we have seriously conflicting interests in play there, because, you know, some people want to go and settle and they want to do it as quickly as possible Other people have an interest in the potential for extant or extinct life there, microbial. I mean, there's nothing big there, but there could be something still in the subsurface. And or, Mars as a world that could have previously been alive. There's just so much science that remains to be done. And as soon as humans get there, you've kind of really messed up some of those chances. So you've got a direct kind of set of conflicting interests there. Now they could be negotiated in terms of, one party agreeing, okay, we'll slow down, we'll observe the more stringent planetary protection guidelines, et cetera. But that's not the way that things are going at the moment. They're going faster, and it's towards rolling back planetary protection. So that has, some scientists kind of going, and another analogy here on Earth where I was kind of starting this off was, if you think about, the purpose of a national park, and I know this one is really salient in the US at the moment. Some people think it's for the preservation of habitat for wildlife and for, the other life forms with whom we share this world, who have less and less space all the time. Some people figure it's for the enjoyment of human beings, and other people think they're for resources and for profit. And we're going to have to negotiate those exact same kinds of problems in space as well. And just one last thing on that kind of subject of, other life. Again, back to this subject of like, who is we? We think of ourselves as just sort of bounded human entities, right? And kind of a lot of our speculation about what our lives would be like off-world assume that we're going to be much the same. Those who've been to space know that there are changes in space. We also don't have all that much data for really long range exposure and what the changes are to humans, but also for the microorganisms that we take with us, because a lot of the cells in your body are not in fact human. And we don't have enough data about what happens to those as exposure gets more and more prolonged. So I just say there are a lot of open questions there regarding the science.
Yeah, we have a journey to go. Manu, you want to make any comments on this before we move on?
I will just say, so coming back to your question, I want to point to a couple of initiatives that the UN Office of Outer Space already has. So they have the Human Space Technology Initiatives that is directed at emerging space nations for human spaceflight and science and experiments. Coordinating and collaborating with the more established countries. So I think that that mechanism, that platform has shown to be really productive and proactive, and I think that will only expand further.
Yeah, if I can take before we move on, I'd like to take the conversation back to something Catherine mentioned, which is about the we, because one of the things, as you think about a civilization that's moving out into this, into say just the moon, let's not even go as far as Mars, and you've got people living there for months, years, people might be born there. Your relationship with Earth is different. Even just evolutionary, how your body changes or your structure changes or your organism changes because of the effect of a lower gravitational field. We don't know these things, and so we have really no idea how that evolutionary path is going to shape us both psychologically and physically. And I don't know if anyone would like to comment on that, but I think that is certainly an unknown, a big unknown for us, even after all the experience we have in human spaceflight and in microgravity right in low Earth orbit. So if anyone wants to make any comments on that.
Just that I agree thoroughly. It's easy to forget these things because of all the wonderful successes that have occurred in the space program. But yeah, there's so much that isn't known, and all of our speculation about what a society would look like. It's just really important to keep that piece, that big open question about, can we actually physiologically do this, and what will the cost to the individual be? How will the risks accumulate over time? And there may even be a tipping point where it's like, is it worth it? Should it be us, or should it just be the robots?
Well,
And, those are the questions I think, sorry, Sandy, those are the questions that governments are motivated to answer, right? I mean, I think that's why the people that say, NASA ought to get out of the business and let the billionaires explore, the billionaires don't have interest in understanding all those questions. I mean, okay, that's probably harsh, but I mean, there's a government interest in many of the research topics, and there's not only for advancing technologies that take exploration further, but for benefiting life on Earth, and the research into the human body, the research into various systems is all has not only space exploration benefits, but benefits here on Earth. And I think It's just important for us to recognize that that we need government investments to not only get this going, but to sustain an off-world presence. You know, the government are never going to be asked to sustain it, right? Like was said earlier, but that said, they will always be a key stakeholder.
Yeah, from my viewpoint, from an explorer viewpoint, it's like, I think open questions are great. I mean, this is excellent. We know the questions, I think the questions are going to lead to other questions, and we're going to be on a constant voyage of discovery and learning. And, you know, Catherine, to your point, some of it may not be answers that we like, but that's sort of life, right? We're all on this voyage of discovery during our lives, and there's a lot of things that we don't understand. Like, look at the environment we're in now. We're on a voyage of discovery there. And I think that to me is just fascinating, that we continue to challenge ourselves as humans with these unknown situations to try and figure out, who are we? Where are we going? What is our purpose? And space is sort of that big question writ large for everybody, whatever the answer, right? Whatever the answer. Why don't we go ahead and move to our last topic, because the time is going so fast. And again, we could spend so much depth in any one of these. But the final question we want to talk about is, how do we stay there? You know, right now, of course, we send people to orbit, we stay, we come back. Even one could argue in the near future, when we send people to the moon and Mars, they'll probably stay and come back. But when we think about sustainability, we think about the complexity of actually creating a civilization on a body that is not necessarily as resource rich or designed for human consumption. You know, that it's expensive. Catherine, to your point, it's expensive. Is it worth it? You know, is it the huge amount of energy to keep up a sustainable system? And what does that mean in the context of using local resources? What does the logistics chain look like? Is it even practical? You know, these are kind of the questions I think we have to tackle when we think about how are we going to stay there. And so, Catherine, why don't you go first this time, and then we'll go around to Manu and then Kathy.
Uh-oh. I guess I would have to come back to our original session description for this long ago. So we were asking questions like, as we evolve off our planet as a species, will we mature and choose to be the best version of ourselves, or will our ego-driven selves prompt us to to repeat the same mistakes? That was kind of the session description. And my answer to that, and I think it speaks to this larger question that we have here, is that humans do a spectrum of behavior. So anytime you're kind of presented with a set of binary options, like, are we going to be the best version of ourselves? Will we be ego-driven and make mistakes? The answer is just yes. Humans do human things, and that involves usually this spectrum of behavior. It's cultural, it's political, it's rarely binary. And in terms of, you know, just where it all goes, I think we're negotiating so many different changes here on this planet at this moment. We're, you know, making a transition in our relationship with machines. This is unprecedented. Obviously, machines and ways of magnifying labor have transformed human societies repeatedly, whether that's, you know, at the dawn of agriculture or the harnessing of hydropower or whatever it is that you want to think about. But in terms of intelligent machines, things are changing extremely quickly on that front. And so this is another reason why I wonder about, you know, this focus on the human presence in space, because, you know, 10 years from now, what those capabilities are going to be, I think it's going to kind of shift the overall picture about, you know, who do we think we are? What do we think that we're doing? In terms of, you know, that this, again, and that again will also kind of change and expand our sense of, well, who is we? In terms of that sustainability, I think, you know, the usual take on it is simply that the only way to sustain space exploration is to, you know, make money from it, you know, hence the importance of the harvesting of resources. But in terms of, you know, say, how do you do that research, you know, as Kathy was saying, that, you know, is about human safety, is about the human organism for prolonged space exposure. I do think, you know, we have a very real challenge right now in nations that are pouring a lot of money into these kinds of questions. So you're talking about, you know, the physiological and mental and psychological health of a tiny, tiny, tiny number of people at exactly the same time when the headlines and the fact that we're doing this via Zoom demonstrates we don't really have a grip on how to do that well for the many. And similarly, we have, devoting all this attention to other environments while we do not have a grip on our own, the crises of climate change, of water shortages, all of those different things. I know that space research pays dividends into other domains of the world. There's no question about that. And obviously some space technologies, as Manu can speak to, given the work that Space Enabled does, has direct relevance and direct support for Earth, and for UN development goals. But there are different kinds of space exploration and there are different kinds of space technologies, and they don't all do the same thing. And so I think, we do have to ask these questions about sustainability and benefit. Who would benefit the most from different kinds of space endeavors? So, and I think in order to create something where it's how do we stay there? Again, it comes down to, well, how big do you want your we to be? If you want your we to be tiny and elite and hyper wealthy, well, fine, you can figure out your own little problems. But if you want space to be something kind of more in line with the spirit of the Outer Space Treaty that really is for everyone, then it's a much bigger challenge on absolutely every front. And it's slower and it's harder. So that's, I think, kind of my take on that.
Okay, I'll have some comments in a moment, but let's go through Manu and Kathy first. So Manu?
So let me take it from a technical standpoint and answer, how do we sustainably stay there? And I think one thing that we as a space industry really need to do is look outside our own bubble. So there are sectors like the mining sector, water management, food production, energy sectors that have been working on these questions for a really long time. Not necessarily in the context of, Moon, Mars, and exploration, but they have a wealth of knowledge that we really need to tap into. So I think that that's really pivotal, that we as engineers understand that we don't have the answers to all of the questions, but by having these conversations with other sectors, we really benefit from learning from their lessons. And I do want to make a point, Catherine, thank you for the shout out to Space Enabled. I do want to make a point, about the Outer Space Treaty, which was ratified in 1967. But it's really this concept of exploration and the use for the benefit of all countries, and where it's not subject to national appropriation or claim to sovereignty. So we really need to think about not just the technical logistic factors, but as Catherine said, about the sustainability of the human race going forward.
Kathy?
So I think we will be able to stay. We will have a sustainable effort if we take care and recognize that building this sustainable effort requires a diverse set of stakeholders, stakeholders like governments, like academia, like private industry, like international partners, like private citizens. There's a diverse set of stakeholders that we need to be able to include in the defining how we go and what we do. And I think that we need to remember that to be sustainable, we will need to continue to deliver value to all these stakeholders, right? And the value will be to the stakeholders, to people on Earth, to people who are off-world, to people who love people who are off-world. I mean, there will be value that can be described in many different ways. It will be money. It will be all sorts of different things. And as long as when there is value delivered, right? People will continue to put time, and they'll continue to put money, and they'll continue to put their sweat equity, their personal commitment on board. You can imagine things might happen when people are off world, and that they can only be resolved by people digging deep and being their better selves, right? I mean, that's an example of if you're getting value out of being there, you will do that. So I would say, just recognize that we have to deliver value to the stakeholders, and that means understand your stakeholders and what they value, and make sure that what you do and how you do it keeps that in mind. You can, let's say NASA's building a coalition of private industry and international partners, and we're going to go to the moon. And let's say a president comes along and says, no international partners, this is something we're going to do alone. Well, that alienates a key stakeholder, and that takes away a supporting, I think, a supporting element. This administration is valuing the international partnerships in exploration, but it's not outside the realm of possibility to think, especially with the COVID response. There's a lot of nationalism, that you see sprouting around the world, and hopefully we can hold that back, right? Because again, like I said, maintaining the stakeholder group and delivering value to them is what's going to keep it sustainable.
So Catherine, I'd like to go back. I think you brought up some really interesting points about the we, also your comment about, the civilization on Earth and the different experiences that people have around the world. I kind of step back when people have these debates about who's the we and who's going where and doing what for what reasons. I kind of step up really, really high to like the 100,000 foot level and think about humans. We're like a mass group, right? It's just like this group of people with a huge variety of experiences, even here on Earth, about how we live and what we do. And if you project out, 1,000 years from now, right? Or even thinking about what's going on now, there's people on sort of the leading edge of pushing what humans can do, regardless of whether that's space or living up on Mount Everest or whatever. There's a group that's pushing ahead, there's a group that's kind of fallen behind, and there's everybody else in the middle. So I don't know if it's a Gaussian curve, but it's some curve where the experience base, I was horrified the first time I traveled to Africa and I saw women walking to the wells and they didn't have access to fresh water. It's like, what the heck is up with that? That's ridiculous, right, in this day and age. Or I remember being in India and I was driving around in a car watching a guy plow a field with oxen, and they have a space program. And and that's not good or bad. That's just a statement about the wide variety of human experience here on the planet. And so I look at this push to get people out into space, just an expansion of that whole basic set of human experiences as the mob of what we call humanity tries to figure out its evolutionary path into the future. This is one potential path, another one could be something completely different. And so the we at the beginning might be a small number of we, but one could surmise that if that evolutionary path looks good or positive, or looks like there's something there, the massive group will follow. It might take 1,000 years, it might take 100 years, it might take 500 years, or we could end going up there and go, wow, you know what? This is a disaster and evolutionary way. We don't want to do this. So I think your questions are an interesting one, but I think to answer them in the context, we got to step back at a higher level. So I'll just offer that to the group. Yeah, Catherine, go ahead.
I think I appreciate the perspective. There's a great deal that's of value there. Stepping back even further, so from the the anthropological and human history perspective, it's absolutely true that different groups of people have taken different paths. And so some people have been primarily seafaring, some people have been more agricultural, some people have industrialized, others have not. But I think something that's just really important to realize is how much our fates today are intertwined. So the fact that you have, say in some countries, multiple countries, a space program with elite, highly trained engineers and a good deal of infrastructure supporting that and a bureaucracy supporting that. And you also have people who do not have access to clean water. Those things are not just kind of separate realities. These people have what they have because these people don't.
See, I don't know if I can accept that is it's an either, that those are mutually exclusive. I think it's part of the spectrum, and I don't think because we have one, it's why we don't have the other. The space station program was successful because everybody who contributed to it really, really believed in fixing, in solving that particular problem. We haven't, as a species, I think, decided that these other problems, there's not that passion around really, really solving the problems, because if we decide to solve all the problems on the planet, we totally could. We just don't have that will globally. to do
I
that.
think if we delve into the history of colonialism, it will show something else about the distribution of wealth. And indeed, I mean, if you look at, say, how the Industrial Revolution itself started, so the beginning of this trend towards machines, you see that some people benefited enormously and other people did not, and that those things are not completely independent. So I agree, it's not always the case, but I would say that it's sometimes the case. And I think that we need to bear that in mind,
Yeah,
especially in an era of private capital.
yeah, Kathy or Manu, I don't know if either one of you want to jump in here. Now, Catherine and I could go on for hours. Kathy?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I agree with you, Sandy. I don't know. It's a hard one, right? I think to the extent that the space program also is a motivator for STEM education. I mean, there's a benefit there in there's a role that investments in space might have, even by the people that can afford them, that will lift up people that want to be lifted up all around the world.
Yeah. Manu, any comments?
I'll just add that, this conversation is still a very privileged conversation. There are many people around the world who just, this is not within their realm, which is absolutely fine for now, as long as we're bringing them on this journey with us. And I think that we need to think about, when we are thinking about sustainability, how do we ensure that the money and the resource investment into an off-world civilization is really benefiting everybody on the spectrum.
Catherine, any other comments? We are running down in time here. So if anyone has any closing comments, I wanted to give you an opportunity to do so. Catherine, do you have any closing comments?
Just that I'm so appreciative of this conversation, and I hope that there will be many more like it, both in relation to Ascend, but just in as a part of the space community. I know in my years of working in and around the space community, this is, the dialogues like this have been tremendously rewarding. And I'm also so pleased to be part of an all-woman conversation regarding space, because it is different. Obviously, we need to have many different kinds of conversations, but I think this is an important one, and supporting women who are coming into the space sector. Because again, on this principle that space should be for everybody, I think it's a really important step forward. So yeah, I think my overall kind of take homes are, if we're going to learn from Earth, then we need to really learn from Earth, including some of the things that we don't necessarily want to think about how what our patterns are regarding, say, resource management, regarding sharing, and regarding power and regarding resources. Yeah. So I think if we bear all these things in mind, and if we stick to the multilateral models that are being worked through, I think there are tremendous grounds for hope. I'm also have some concerns, but that'll be for another day. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, Kathy?
Yeah, I really liked what Catherine had to say. I mean, it is nice to be part of this all-woman discussion, and it's not usual that I'm in a discussion with where some of these topics have been raised, and I really appreciate that. I think to something Manu said earlier, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with this. Leaders have to be responsible for bringing everybody along or making sure everyone can benefit. Yeah, I mean, that's what you can say that and mean one thing, or you can say that and mean another thing. And I think we're going to get to an off-world civilization when people that can have the ability and have the resources to lead do that. And if they do that in a way where they provide, role models and opportunity and inclusion, then we're going to get there. If there is too much of a push to say, every step of the way everybody has to benefit equally, then honestly we're not going to get there. The people that have the ability to push things forward are not going to be motivated to do that, right? So we have to find the balance. I'm certainly supportive of space being for everybody. Off-world solution, an off-world vision has to be something that everybody embraces, but I think it's the devil's in the details in how we enable it. But I really enjoy the conversation, and hope we can do it again sometime.
Okay, Manu?
Yeah, I would agree with Kathy. The devil is in the detail. And, you know, what I really enjoy from this is that this is just the starting point of a discussion that can go on much, much longer. And what I really appreciate is that while we all are kind of sold on the idea of an off-world civilization, human spaceflight exploration, these different perspectives means that we're really exchanging insights and learning from each other. So, you know, to have someone like Catherine really think about like the justice and the we, and then the engineering, logistics, and Sandy, for you to give an overarching perspective, I think is really interesting and is key for future discussions going forward.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I enjoyed the conversation. I know we could, again, go on for hours with these different perspectives. There's a lot of open questions in front of the community. Conversations like this are important because they tease out the important open questions and really help, I think, over time focus the community on what needs to be addressed. And Catherine, I love your perspectives that, you know, a lot of times those of us in the space community, you know, down in the details and working the day-to-day stuff, don't step back to think about some of these other questions, and we need to. And so this was a wonderful conversation. We've covered a lot. There's a lot more to cover. I encourage everyone to visit ascend.events, talk future, and the conversation will go on. And Ascend, of course, is happening this fall in November, where there'll be many, many more conversations like this as well. Thank you all for joining, and we hope you enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you again to our generous sponsors. These conversations are continuing, and we have an incredible community coming together to share ideas and collaborate. Please take a look at this brief video about how you can also participate.
How do we accelerate the commercialization of space?
So I originally signed up for Ascend because I wanted to.
I am excited for Ascend because my students want to go.
The space industry right now is really at kind of a renaissance.
As we look at the off-world future,
You know, new space.
we need a means to be able to collapse space and time.
We invite you all to share your own story at ascend.events/wisdom. The link is also in the chat. Thank you for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay.